Okay, guys, thanks for sitting through this panel. It's always interesting to see who wants to talk about manufacturing and product development. So there are actually more people than I expected, so that's great. I always say with AI, like AI has to run on something, and I think we found this morning that the pace and acceleration of software development in AI is really create an opportunity for hardware, right? It's more and more chipsets. Chips have to do faster and faster processing. So I have a really awesome panel here. So I'm going to let you guys introduce yourselves and your backgrounds, then we'll get right into it.
All right, I'll go first. Can you guys hear me? Amish Patel, long-time Microsoft employee for working on hardware for a while, so definitely know the plights of building and manufacturing at scale. Then founded a few companies in the hardware software space, mostly medical devices, wearable technologies, and now running Conduit Venture Labs. We're a venture studio focused on creating portfolios of companies that leverage hardware and software and AI towards climate and healthcare.
Thank you, Susan. Terry Arbaugh, Chief Commercial Officer with CComp. We are an electronics manufacturer, so we design and manufacture consumer, commercial, industrial, medical, electronic devices in China. Recently opened our new factory in Tijuana, Mexico. So any questions around manufacturing, scaling, supply chain, all that is usually what I talk about. We work with both startups and enterprise companies at all different stages of product development and scaling large volume manufacturing.
And my name is Miles Severud. I'm the founder of Performant Manufacturing, which is a local R&D small-scale contract manufacturer. So we're downtown Barrio Logan. We work with startups as well, and we kind of bridge the gap between very early prototype concepts to a larger scale manufacturer like CComp.
Okay, awesome. All right, Terry, I'm going to start with you. Can you define sort of the trends in manufacturing in terms of onshore, nearshore, offshore, and what is kind of running those trends? What are sort of the reasons behind these trends? And then I think you talk a little bit about what you guys have just created.
Yeah, sure. Biggest trend that we're seeing, I referenced in the intro. So we've been manufacturing in China for quite a long time. We've recently opened a factory in Tijuana that is part of the biggest, largest trend we're seeing. Obviously, in 2018, with the start of the 25% or up to 25% Section 301 tariffs that were implemented on products coming in from China, that created a huge trend or investment towards getting out of China, right? So we originally looked around a lot of countries in Southeast Asia for our China plus one strategy. Where were we going to set up a second manufacturing location? And being a local San Diego company, we're headquartered in Carlsbad, where we do design, engineering. We have our C-suite, finance, accounting, marketing, project management there. We thought Tijuana would be a great location for us. So being, an hour and a half between global headquarters office and factory is huge for us. It's really nice. We've got SMT lines. We're installing injection molding, and we'll do full box build product manufacturing there as well, and that's really representative of a larger trend. A lot of companies moving outside of China for assembly and manufacturing, although in our world, we're all still relying on China for component sourcing, and a lot of the components and materials are still coming from that region, but having manufacturing outside of China is the biggest trend that we've seen.
Can you also explain just how that impacts the tariff situation when you actually have a company or a factory that's located in Mexico?
Yeah, absolutely. So like I mentioned, buying components from China, bringing them in through the port of LA or Long Beach generally is how we're going to operate. We will truck those components in bond down to Mexico. So they don't technically land in the US, so they don't trigger that 25% import tariff. So you get them into Mexico, you do your manufacturing, you have to qualify what's called substantial transformation. So you change those components into a different finished good tariff code that then gets imported into the US as a country of origin. Mexico product, therefore, does not have any of those tariffs. And just incidentally, really quickly, on average, maybe 15 to 18% higher finished goods unit price coming out of Mexico from an apples to apples manufacturing standpoint, finished good on the factory floor. But when you take total cost of ownership into account, you avoid a tariff, you avoid the shipping time, whether it's ocean or cost of air shipping from China, and it's right here, a couple hours away. It's your total cost of ownership, even with a higher product cost, is generally lower out of Mexico if you're facing one of those 25% tariffs.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, this is for Miles and for Amish. I would love to talk to you guys about prototyping, materials, like how you see a lot of the digital transformation and changing the way that you guys have built products in the past and how you expect to build them in the future. So either you can start.
All right, I'll talk about prototyping. I mean, over the last, I would say, 2-3 years, certainly the Xometry's Proto Labs really turned prototyping upside down. We got away from local machine shops and we got into, quick turn, relatively cheap, high fidelity prototype for parts. I think there are still certainly challenges in the assembly part, and integration part. But prototyping, I think over the last few years has gotten a lot easier with services like those. And yeah, I don't know. I don't have a solution for the assembly part for prototypes yet, but that's just what's on my mind.
Yeah, I think just like to combine the theme, if I can remember what it was. On the prototype to V1 on the venture building side, so I come from like CPTO of early stage to getting it to, 5,000 units. And then I generally Series A and I leave, so that's not how I have to worry about it. But when we think about that scale and just kind of the nearshoring conversation as well, it's just like the facilities being in the West Coast time zone alone, like for an early stage startup, changes everything, right? So from the prototyping stage, it's nice now. Like turnkey, you can upload your CAD, you get these really nice finishes, materials, like proto molds, et cetera, and you can hand assemble in the back of your startup, kind of spot or some sort of local facility, which gets you far enough. As a person who's done med devices, well, that doesn't really get you far enough to where you need to be in compliance. And sometimes you can get away with that, but finding facilities to do that, some people have some turnkey places in some cities. But the biggest challenge was taking that leap from, okay, great, we've built a prototype, but now I got to go build 5,000 units at production quality that pass regulatory and compliance. And in many ways, it killed a lot of early stage startups because if you didn't have experience going to Asia, you didn't have a team big enough, you didn't have anyone on the ground, you didn't know where to go, how to work, what to expect, and you didn't know how to drive those conversations. And I remember 2 startups ago, we decided to make the change to Tijuana, actually. It was a helmet company where we decided to do full assembly, painting, everything there rather than in Asia, and it changes the economics completely because our team could fly within a day. We could build things faster. But just to kind of add to the spectrum of that, like I think we de-risked probably millions in arrays just to not having to go back and forth between Asia. And so like this nearshoring trend, even though what kicked it off might have been not that, it's going to be very helpful for the early stage companies in general.
I want to just comment one more thing. One trend I've seen in the last 2 years too is the big manufacturers, at least in my experience in Mexico, is that they have less of an appetite for the low volume and the smaller production. They used to have kind of like their own venture NPI group, but a lot of them haven't really been into that recently. I don't know if you've got any comments on that.
One thing that's great about China for electronics manufacturing in general, it's a lot of people think it's cheap and it's low quality. For a lot of devices, small devices that we're all very familiar with, it's the best place in the world to manufacture. It's the most supply chain depth, the most expertise, right? The most agility and speed to get things done and scaled very, very quickly. In China, within 10 miles of our factory, literally everything you need, every component, every expert, every process is in that area. You don't necessarily have that same thing available to you in Mexico. So, yeah, it's not surprising that there's not as much appetite for the smaller, lower quantity type stuff. It needs to be more stable. It needs to be higher volume to make more sense in Mexico.
So I kind of love to hear your perspective and how you work with some of these early stage companies, Miles.
Yeah, and I do think there's a bit of kind of thrashing, for lack of a better phrase, going on right now. If it's a solo entrepreneur, sometimes it's getting to a Kickstarter package. If it's a larger Fortune 500 company with an innovation group, they're ready to invest in tooling up front to speed up to get the big machine going faster. So, it's the answer. It depends. Unfortunately, I think the role of getting across that valley is working with the team who needs this prototype and understanding like precisely what they need and why, and designing the part in a way when we hand it off to a manufacturer, you're not starting from zero. Like you've used the right practices. Maybe you working with a contract manufacturer early, which is something I'd suggest, to make sure like the way you're designing your files, the way you're generating your file formats, the tolerances you're making are compatible with machines on where you plan to build it, I think are some of the big lessons learned I'm seeing. I don't have like a graceful, if you're a solo entrepreneur, this is where you need to get to. If you're a big company, this is where you need to get to. It's unfortunately really situational right now.
I'm going to ask all three of you. Okay, so Amish, I'd love to know from your perspective, you're building companies that are at the intersection of hardware and software. So when you think about kind of advising the CEOs and spinning them out, what kind of guidance do you give them in terms of how you need to think about how you're developing this product and what manufacturing path you need to take?
Well, I tell them to call you, so that's
And then I talk to David.
that's why we work together, and then you call that guy. So that's the actual answer. I just call her, but I think it's for us, there's lots of hardware projects, right? Like the stuff Faraday and are working on is like then the deep tech side is very different, right? Like these massive scale carbon products and stuff. And we're very much on the commodity hardware, sensory IoT, wearables, applied robotics space. So, it's really about understanding, your BOM economics, your margin, right? Like I think the way we think about it is always about, we're talking about ventures, not just the product. So it's how does the hardware, and we're talking about hardware enabling software products very specifically. So it's all about really from the business model backwards. And understanding, especially for early stage, like pre-seed, seed A, looking at debt and cash flow is always a fun one, and like these more business economics that then drive decisions to even how you design or execute your V1 or V2 product. Like we always, especially when it's new entrepreneurs that haven't done hardware before, it's like it's really the 1.5 that's your one, and the 2 that's actually your one, and how do you think about the proto build that gets you to pilot that then informs the next decision in the iterative cycle of hardware. I think people don't think of hardware as iterative in that sense when it comes from like a product perspective. They think if I've just built the thing's going to 1, be scalable, 2, I'm going to be able to source the entire supply chain for it, and then I'm done. And the reality is it just like software, it's iterative just on a different cycle. So that's one thing we always advise. And then the other side is you need to factor it in just like you would cloud infrastructure or the cost of your LLMs or your GPU compute. It's the same thing about time, cost, cash flow, and margin. That's the same equation, but I don't think a lot of people think about it that way. They think software is one thing, hardware is another, and I'll put a fixed cost in my operating budget, and it's just all going to work out. And the reality is that's not how supply chain works, right? And I think I've learned the hard way. You've probably learned the hard way too.
I've tried many
and
times.
in the corporate world, we have these amazing teams, that NPI teams and stuff that take care of it for us. And when you're on the product side, you just kind of build it, and then somehow it gets done. Once you get into the startup world, that's not how that works anymore. And I think to your point, like working really closely with the CMs from the day you print your first part, making that relationship and taking them on the journey, like they want you to succeed. They want you to hand them something that they can build efficiently. So I don't think many startups do that at all.
So Terry, I'd love to hear your perspective, like when you want to talk to entrepreneurs, what's sort of like your sort of perfect scenario when people are coming to you to ask about manufacturing?
Yeah, for us, we're looking to help companies scale. So we regularly refer companies that we talk to somebody like Miles. If it's too early, if a company's not ready to scale into, at least $1 million, couple $1 million in revenue and beyond in annual manufacturing spend, that's not really a good fit for us, which we're on the smaller side. Like you were mentioning, a lot of the bigger companies that have global footprints in manufacturing might not talk to you if you're not doing 25, 50, $100 million in spend in production, right? So we're not job shop small. We're a little bit larger than that. We usually say, industrial, medical, consumer products small enough to fit into an oven, so we're not doing massive things. We're doing thermostats. We do a lot of smart home products, things like that. So that's who we like to work with. the teams we work with, if they're startups, we of course like them to be well funded, and we like them to have somebody on their team that has some hardware experience. Because educating somebody who's never built, designed, built, tooled, certified, sold an electronic or a hardware product is a challenge, right? So one of the things that we see really, really often with startups that I would just caution everybody against is when you're going to manufacturing, usually you spent a lot of money, you're bootstrapping or you're really tight on budget. So you go to a manufacturer that's going to do some design for manufacturing work for you. They're going to help you finish your design, right? And they're offering to do that without you paying for it. That's a huge red flag, right? If you don't know what's about to happen, right, then it gets a lot of people in trouble. And what happens is, of course, they'll do some design work. They'll end up manufacturing something for you that is your product in your mind, of course. And if something happens in that relationship and you say, actually, I'd like to take my files, we're actually going to go to a different manufacturer, they say, no, those are our files. We're not manufacturing what you gave us. We're manufacturing the output of what we've designed, right? And then there's this IP theft claim. We always call it an IP fumble. You kind of gave it away. If you haven't paid for it, if you haven't very clearly contractually decided or shown who owns what in this relationship, you can set yourself up for trouble. It's really attractive if you don't have the money up front and you know how much it costs to tool and certify and do all these other things to get you to market. So you're building not a product, you're building a business, and you're protecting IP, you're building programming and testing equipment, right? It's not just a product. Again, it's an entire solution that you're building to try to build a business around. And if you haven't thought about all those things, you can really get in trouble.
Awesome. Actually, a quick question about IP. There's a lot of people that get very concerned about IP, and once they give it off to a manufacturer, that they're going to lose their IP and how they protect it. And I'd love to hear kind of really from any of you how you guys think about it when you're working with other companies, or you're building companies, or you're working in manufacturing. What's the IP conversation?
I actually want to know what you
Yeah. No, for us, it's really interesting. We're structural. We're a Carlsbad, U.S. based company, and so all of our customer contracts, master services agreements, everything else are with a U.S. entity, and it's like a terrible sales pitch, but we say you can sue us, right? Like if something goes south, where a lot of times if you have a company overseas, and this is not a China problem, IP theft or the thing I just described, it's not, don't think China when I say this. This can happen anywhere in the world. But we have a U.S. entity, we have contracts, again, we draw them up very, very clearly on what you're hiring us to do. When we do engineering work, we have a manufacturing exclusivity period tied to any design work we do, and the exchange for that is the customer owns all the IP, all of the work product, right? So it's a very clear contract that we set out up front. Not everybody does that. So I think if you don't have the experience talking to people that do, talking to lawyers, talking to companies that operate internationally, if you sign an NDA or certain agreements in the U.S., they hold no water potentially in China, right? So if there's so many things you don't know, that talking to people that do know and have been there is the best advice I can give anyone.
Yeah, I will just highlight that it is a concern, and it's scary, and it's like no one really knows when you're just starting out. I will say more on a tactical level, if you are in hardware product development, simple things like making sure you own the IP rights to all your design files, and then when you are exchanging information, for instance, if you're designing CAD in SolidWorks, like setting an upfront expectation that you are getting SolidWorks files back of the design changes they're making. They're not sending you like an exported step file. They're sending you like files that then you can go modify and take elsewhere and do things like that. So I can't comment on like the larger IP scene, but there's some like more tactile things you should do to be able to pick up and go somewhere else. That is the most leverage you can have as a designer as you're scaling up, in my experience.
Okay. Okay, so I want to talk about sustainability, materials, what you guys are seeing on that aspect. It used to be back in the day, it was like, obviously China was not known for sustainability and some of the materials, but thinking through what you're seeing, and I always thought one of the most overlooked ideas, and this is from my manufacturing background, material science. there's so much that can be done with materials, and so much of it never gets out of the lab. And I think one of my goals is to bring a lot of that stuff into everyday manufacturing. Okay, thank you for that. So I'd love for you guys to just talk about kind of what you're seeing trends, sustainability, materials, as you're thinking through working with companies, or even, you know, if you're actually manufacturing at scale for larger companies.
I think from the product, I guess, design or inception side of the panel, it's a great time, right? One, climate sustainability focus just in a generation of folks who care more about it. Industrial designers, material science, like there's just a more conscious element to designing ethically with sustainability, recycle, circular economy, right? Like how's this gonna be trashed? I don't think we ever thought about that when we were building mice at Microsoft back in the day. We were like, oh, what's gonna happen to this? Like the battery goes somewhere. We never thought about these things, but these are now becoming standard practices from not only the creators, but also the industrial design firms and the design agencies. And it's becoming part of the playbook of design. So just having that be part of the consideration set. And then it's really exciting on the manufacturing side. As someone who worked on a hybrid textile component integrated IC thing, things like technologies like seamless knit and things like this that allow you to use new materials in different ways so that the process has changed, right? Like I worked on a seamless knit wearable suit, right? And as all of a sudden we could use different things that could go into the machine, which then changed the entire formula of what kind of things, what kind of materials we want to design with in practice, right? Elaston and like these other things that come from aloe and natural places. So, and I think lastly, just to add as like a fun thing, if we're seeing a lot, is just in the plastics, right? We're seeing these like really interesting circular economy based technologies that are helping us get PET and all these other things from other sources, from, you know, recycling clothing to from food waste to compostables. And I think there's just really interesting ways. I know Microsoft put out a new mouse recently, and that was made out of ocean plastic, right? And those cost margins are getting better as the new technologies around processing waste into new materials. And I think that's just super exciting. We're just seeing a lot there.
Yeah, from the prototyping, I wish it was more in the conversation. I think speed is so critical in your first steps, and most people don't have a lot of funding. So we don't talk about sustainability once we're getting into prototyping enough, like hands down. It's usually when you're designing the product and you're an ID, I've seen it, hey, wouldn't it be nice if we could use this? Wouldn't if we could source from the US? And then we get into reality and it's like, I need a prototype yesterday and I need it under this budget. And yeah. And then what I have found is when you get to a contract manufacturer, you start speccing what plastic you're going to be shooting, for instance, right? And that is another really good opportunity to make an impact on it. But yeah, from the prototype, unfortunately, it's not too present.
Yeah, and then when it gets to us, quite often we've got a design. Most of the time the design is given to us that we manufacture from a customer. So we usually build to a spec, and it's cost and drop testing, or this thing has to live outside and survive, you know. So a lot of the alternate materials don't meet those specs or are just too expensive for our customers to consider most of the time. And also the availability in China hasn't been spectacular for things. So one of the really cool parts about being locally here in Tijuana now, having this manufacturing, having access to some different materials. One of the things we are going to start proactively doing is quoting, you know, if a customer asks us to quote PC or PCABS, maybe, hey, for this delta, we could use this component and we could participate in some of that cost delta. So these are initiatives we're currently looking at and considering now that we've just opened this new factory, but certainly cost and quality drives most of our material decisions.
Okay. Last question. I think I have 1 minute. Okay, I'm not going to ask the last question. I'm going to open up to 2 or 3 questions if there's anyone in the audience.
I have a good question. So if what's the best way of, I guess, protecting an idea, right? You file a patent, and then when you go work with some kind of prototyping company, you do an NDA. Is that enough, or one has to do more to protect the idea?
There was just an IP session in this room an hour ago, and they repeatedly said layered strategies of IP and idea protection. And they also said big companies will happily infringe on your small company patent because patent enforcement is not free and they have deeper pockets than you, was the message up here. So maybe.
Yeah. I look at it like kind of your marketing budget as well. Like it should scale with how big your company is, you know? Like simple things like NDAs up front are obvious, but the minute you get some funding or the minute you're growing your team, mental reminder to get some legal on your team to at least just see what you're doing. And so, yeah.
Yeah.
So I heard you at the beginning say that apple-to-apple cost of manufacturing, China and Mexico is 18%. Did I hear that right?
Yeah, 15 to 18% roughly.
Okay, on what scale, what volume?
A few variables. Call it. Let me give you one example. So we make a small product for Brita that goes in the top of the water pitcher. It's 50 cents in materials. It costs about $1. There's 23 people on the line. We build 60,000 units a week. There's 3 to 4 million a year on that. Something like that is not going to be 15 or 18% more in Mexico. It would be drastically more in Mexico than in China. Now, if you have a product that's got a $100 BOM and it takes 6 people to do the assembly at 10,000, 20,000 units, probably 15-ish%. So the overhead differences in Mexico versus China, it's not really labor rate driven. Some of the material costs are going to be higher in Mexico, than in China. But yeah, roughly mid-ish volume, 10, 25,000, units, $50 product, probably 15 to 18% higher.
And on the $8 BOM cost, what would it be then?
How many people does it take to assemble? Right, is gonna weigh in, but probably what kind of volume?
100,000 a year.
Yeah, I think that range is probably accurate, right? Now you'll get again, to get the substantial transformation in Mexico. Generally, almost everything in a small electronic product, think a thermostat on the wall, something like that. You're going to have to do the circuit board assembly. You're going to have to do the PCB assembly in Mexico to qualify for the substantial transformation. So you can't just build, have a completed board brought in, throw it in some plastics in a package and shoot it out. That's not going to change the country of origin. So,
And just quick follow-up, what would it be in the US if we could find a manufacturing?
Oh, are you really? You don't want to go there?
What would it be? Yeah.
we don't compete against U.S.
The
manufacturing
labor
a
rates
lot.
are astronomical here. And so I couldn't even tell you. And they won't even in this scale. It's just a lot of places can't scale. It's really, the U.S. to me right now is prototyping only
Or
for the most part.
we gotta probably
Small
go here.
proto runs.
Or if you can fully automate the process, if there's no really human in the loop, I think that's when you're going to be competitive. But
Okay, anyone else? I think it might be lunchtime for everyone. So we want to keep you guys. So thank you very much.
thank you.
Appreciate it.